Thanks very much. Thank you, Lee, and thank you to Cameron for the invitation. Philosophy is a funny business, and philosophers are funny people. Well, some of them are funny. And the philosopher asks you to look at the world awry, to place in question your usual habits, assumptions, prejudices, and expectations. The philosopher asks you to be skeptical about all sorts of things that you ordinarily took for granted. The reality of things in the world, whether the people around you in this room are human beings or really robots. I'll leave that for you to decide. In this regard, the philosopher has, I think, a family resemblance with the comedian. The comedian also asks us to look at the world awry, to imagine a topsy-turvy universe where horses and dogs talk, lifeless objects become suddenly alive, groups of nuns take baths together, and bears engage in civilized conversation with hunters before subjecting them to unmentionable acts. And I'll come back to bears in a little while. So the philosopher and the comedian ask you to look at the world from what we can call a Martian perspective, to look at the world as if you'd landed from another planet, Pluto, Plato, or wherever. And with this rough resemblance in mind, I became interested in the topic of humor and wrote a book about it. It came out a few years ago. It got translated into a few languages, the last being Farsi, which I'm particularly proud of, and I want to send a copy to President Ahmadinejad, particularly because the book is full of Marx Brothers gags and other decadent Western imperialist evidence of the worldwide conspiracy of Jews and homosexuals. So I'm sure it would be welcome with the Iranian regime. But let me begin by considering the question, what takes place in a joke? A joke is a strange but utterly everyday practice, something we all do. But what is that thing that we call joking around? The first thing we can say is that joking is a practice. It's something that we do, and it's something that we find meaningful. Joking has to be something shared between the joke teller and their audience. It has to be a congruence, a congruity between the joke teller and the audience. If you like, there's a tacit social contract at work here, some agreement about the world that we inhabit. And this world is the background to the joke. There has to be some sort of shared understanding, some sort of consensus about what joking means for us, which linguistic routines are recognized as joking, which visual routines are recognized as joking, and the rest. Now, most jokes work through an experience of what we can call incongruity. Incongruity. This is the incongruity theory of humor. The incongruity is an incongruity between what we expect to be the case in a joke and then what takes place. It's what we expect it to be the case and what takes place in the joke. Let me give you 6 examples. 1, do you believe in the life to come? Mine was always that. Have you lived in Peoria all your life? Not yet. Do me a favor and close the window, it's cold outside. If I close it, will that make it warm outside? Do you want 4? Do you want to use a pen? I can't write. That's okay. There wasn't any ink in it anyway. 5, which of the following is the odd one out? Greed, envy, malice, anger, and kindness. And 6, what'll I say? Tell them you're not here. Suppose they don't believe you. Suppose they don't believe me. They'll believe you when you start talking. It's a Marx Brothers gag. In order for the incongruity of the joke to be seen as such, there has to be a congruity between joke structure and social structure. And when this is missing, when this social contract is missing, then laughter will probably not result, which is often the effect of trying to tell a joke in a foreign language, which is a very difficult thing to do, or indeed at the Google offices in New York City. Now, in his classic book, Laughter, the French philosopher Bergson explains what he calls the leading idea in our investigations. The leading idea is the following. It's very simple. This is quoting Bergson. To understand laughter, he says, we must put it back into its natural environment, which is society. And above all, we must determine the utility of its function, which is a social one. Laughter must answer to certain requirements of life in common. It must have a social signification. So, in listening to a joke, I presuppose a social world that is shared, the forms of which the practice of joke-telling is going to play with, it's going to mess with, it's going to screw with. Joking is a game that the players only play successfully if they understand the rules and follow the rules. Wittgenstein, the philosopher, puts the point perspicuously in one of his posthumous remarks. Not spoken after he was dead, but published after he was dead. He spoke after. This is a trick philosophers learn how to speak. In fact, his death is a very funny story, which I could tell you, if you like. But he says, and this is a very interesting remark, what's it like for people not to have the same sense of humor? They do not react to each other properly. It's as though there were a custom amongst certain people for one person to throw another a ball, which he's supposed to catch and throw back. But some people, instead of throwing it back, put it in their pocket. Right? So, joking depends on me throwing you the ball, you throwing the ball back. And once we have that social contract in place, we can engage in the game of joking. If you refuse to play the game, you catch the ball, put it in your pocket, it's not going to work. Now, some anthropologists, and there's a lot of anthropological work on humor, which is fascinating, have compared jokes with rights. I mean, anthropologists are interested in humor because if you can work out the patterns of joke-telling in a society, you can work out how that society functions, as it were, negatively. They compare jokes with rights, R-I-T-E-S, not R-I-G-H-T-S. A right is understood here as something that derives its meaning from a cluster of symbols, a cluster of socially legitimated symbols. Think of a funeral. A funeral is a rite. But insofar as the joke plays with the symbolic forms of society, the bishop gets stuck in a lift, the communion wafer, or those nuns in the bath that I already mentioned, which I can't get out of my mind. Insofar as the joke plays with, I'll tell you that joke as well. No one laughs at that joke. It's a very strange one. Insofar as the joke plays with the forms of society, these jokes might be thought of as anti-rights. So the way in which society functions is through a series of rights. Oh, good Lord. And jokes are like anti-rights. They mock, parody, and deride the practices of a given society. The Czech novelist Milan Kundera remarks, he says, someone's hat falls on the coffin in the freshly dug grave, and the funeral loses its meaning, and laughter is born. So imagine that situation where we have the rite of the funeral, people wearing their hats, the coffin being lowered into the grave. As you lower down, the hat falls onto the coffin and laughter breaks out. At that point, the rite becomes an anti-rite, and you laugh. That's often the way it works. Suppose that someone tells you a joke. This is an old Liverpool joke. That's where I'm from. And my father's favourite jokes. I never left the house as a child. My family was so poor that my mother couldn't afford to buy us clothes. Now, firstly, I recognise that a joke is being told, and I agree to having my attention caught in a certain way. Now, agreeing to having my attention caught is essential. If someone walks away in the middle of the joke or turns to someone else and starts talking, this is bad form or just bad manners. The social contract of the joke-playing game has been broken. So instead of throwing the ball back, I put it in my pocket. So someone begins to tell a joke, and I agree to go along with the joke-telling game. And in agreeing to go along with the joke-telling game, a certain level of tension is aroused in the listener. That's why jokes use repetition, usually threefold repetition. Englishman, Irishman, Scotsman, whatever it might be. Usually groups of three, and the tension builds. And when the punchline kicks in, the little bubble of tension pops, and we feel something that we can call pleasure. Right? Here's an explanation of pleasure. Pleasure is the raising of tension and the lowering of tension. I laugh, or I just smile. When I was 10, my mother bought me a hat so I could look out the window. Right? Punchline to the early joke. Now, what happens here is what another philosopher, Immanuel Kant, not a great humorist himself, there were just two racist jokes in Kant's work, which I won't bore you with, neither of which are very funny. And Kant says that what goes on in humor is an evaporation of expectation to nothing. So I build up expectation through repetition, Englishman, Irish, and Scotsman, and then there's an evaporation of that to nothing, and I experience pleasure. Or I experience what we call comic relief. Right, so comic relief is an experience of pleasure. Now, is that it? Is that an end to the matter? Is it just a question of comic relief? Is that all we can say about humor? This is the elevator. That's right. Cameron told me about this. No, it's not just comic relief. There's more to it than that. Is pleasure simply the raising of tension and the lowering of tension? Something is of little consequence? I think I'll wait for this to stop. I want to claim something else. I want to claim that what goes on in humor is not just comic relief, but what we might call liberation or elevation. Liberation or elevation. That expresses something essential to our humanity. Right? So what goes on in humor, the best humor, is a form of liberation and elevation that expresses something essential to our humanity. Now, there's a longer argument here, but to give you an idea of the thought that I'm after, there's a play by Trevor Griffiths from 1976 called Comedians, which is about a comic school in Manchester, in England. And there's a character called Eddie Waters. He explains how to be a comic in the following terms. Quote, he says, "A real comedian, that's a daring man. He dares to see what his listeners shy away from, fear to express. And what he sees is a sort of truth about people, about their situation, about what hurts or terrifies them, about what's hard, above all, about what they want. A joke releases the tension. Any joke. But a true joke, a comedian's joke, does more than release tension. It has to liberate the will and the desire. It has to change the situation." End of that quote. So a true joke, a comedian's joke, has to change the situation. So any joke releases tension and produces some pleasure. But a real joke, a true joke, a comedian's joke, suddenly and explosively lets us see the familiar defamiliarized, the real rendered surreal, the ordinary made extraordinary. And we laugh or squeal in a sort of infant-like moment of delight. Now, in my view, the best humor brings about a change of situation. It brings about a transient but significant shift in the way we view reality. Now, the idea of humor as a change of situation can be caught in the words of an English anthropologist called Mary Douglas. She says, "A joke is a play upon form that affords us an opportunity for realizing that an accepted pattern has no necessity." So jokes play upon the forms of speech in society. They play upon the accepted practices of a society. And they show that those practices have no necessity. The anti-right of the joke shows the sheer contingency or arbitrariness of the rights in which we engage in social life. So great jokes produce a feeling of contingency. We realize that the state of the rituals and rites that we engage in a society are in fact like the emperor's new clothes, things that we can see through. To that extent, humor has a critical function, a really important critical function with respect to society. Hence the great importance that humor has had in various radical social movements, such as radical feminist humor. How many men does it take to tile a bathroom? I don't know. It depends how thinly you slice them, for example. As the old Italian street slogan has it, una risata vi seppellirà. It will be a laugh that buries you. It will be a laugh that buries you, where the you referred to are those people in power, and in laughing at power, you bury power. Right? So the way in which you do that is by laughing at power, we expose its contingency. We realize that what appeared to be fixed and immutable is contingent and changeable. The emperor's new clothes. It's a sort of thing that can be mocked and ridiculed. So the best humor changes the situation and can also be politically liberating. This is the real importance, say, of satire. Right? And if you think about the situation of satire in this country over the last 5 years, where the task of oppositional politics has fallen to satirists, it's interesting. You know? In dark times, people turn to satire, hence the importance of The Daily Show, Colbert Report, and the rest. So that's the good news, right? So humor is this sort of, is comic relief, pleasure, but it's also something more, a real joke, almost anxiously makes you realize the arbitrariness of the world in which you inhabit, and how that world could be changed in some way. But before we get carried away, it's important to recognize that not all humor is of this kind. A lot of the best jokes are fairly reactionary and simply serve to reinforce the status quo. A little while back, I talked about great humor, true humor, and the rest. But there's also this issue of, let's say, ethnic humor. Right? There are jokes which don't attempt to change the situation, but which attempt to buttress the situation. Most humor is based on recognition. Right? A funny thing happened to me on the way to Walmart. Right? You begin a gag that way. You know what Walmart is, maybe you've gone there, blah, blah, blah. So most comedy is simply comedy of recognition, which most often simply seeks to reinforce the status quo and doesn't seek to criticize or change the situation in which we find ourselves. This is humor which can sometimes reverse social hierarchies in a rather pleasing way, but not in a very radical way. Think, for example, of P.G. Wodehouse, The World of Jeeves, where the butler gets all the best gags, but this is no, as it were, revolutionary subversion of the order of English aristocratic society. It's a pleasing inversion. More egregiously, much humor seeks to confirm the status quo either by denigrating a certain sector of society, as in, say, sexist humor, or by laughing at the alleged stupidity of an outsider. Ethnic jokes usually work by the identification of a stupid outsider, and you laugh at the stupid outsider. The British laugh at the Irish, the Canadians laugh at the Newfies, the Swedes laugh at the Finns, the Germans laugh at the Ostfrieslanders, the Greeks laugh at the Pontians, the Czechs laugh at the Slovaks, the Russians laugh at the Ukrainians, the French laugh at the Belgians, the Dutch also laugh at the Belgians, and of course, we all laugh rather nervously at the Germans. And that's another huge topic, German humor, which I could go into if you want. I don't know who you find stupid, who your stupid outsider is, and I doubt that you'll be able to say in public who your stupid outsider is. But the logic of ethnic humor is the identification of a stupid outsider. The flip side of that is the identification of a clever outsider, who's also an outsider. So most anti-Semitic jokes are jokes about the Jew as outsider, as clever outsider. Also, Anglo-Scottish jokes are traditionally the Scots as mean, clever and mean, as opposed to the anti-Irish jokes, which are the stupid outsider. So the way in which you mark, as it were, the territory of your culture is by identifying stupid outsiders and clever outsiders. This corresponds to a definition of humor that goes a long way back. Another philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, said that laughter is a feeling of sudden glory where I find another person ridiculous and I laugh at their expense. So this sort of humor would work. Somebody comes into the seminar late, they trip up, they fall on their face, we laugh at them, right? That's laughter as a feeling of superiority. And a lot of humor is like that. What do you do with ethnic humor? What do you do with racist humor? This must be analyzed, I think. It must be not simply prohibited through some notion of political correctness, but must be analyzed. I can't explain this fully here, but I've got a theory about this, which is to say that ethnic humor, racist humor, sexist humor are reactionary, and in their untruth, if you like, they tell us important truths about who we are, right? Insofar as someone like me, as an exemplary, white, left-wing philosophy professor, anti-racist, anti-sexist, I might find myself being told a racist joke and refusing to laugh, but internally registering the logic of that. So it's a way of, as it were, realizing how that, say, racism marks your being, even when you don't want to laugh. The way I put this is that racist humor reveals us to be people that we'd frankly rather not be. And that's interesting. Another important theorist of humor that you will have heard of, I guess, Freud. Freud's early idea about humor was that humor, jokes, were the return of the repressed. So what happens in jokes is the repressed elements in society bubble to the surface. The one thing people who haven't read Freud's book about jokes know about the book is it's not funny. It's not true. It's full of great gags, actually. And Freud was a collector of jokes. But let me turn to something closer to home for you, perhaps. As some of you might know to your cost, I've got no idea whether this is the case at Google. Humor is being employed as a management tool by consultants. Imagine, if you will, a company called Humor Solutions International. Such humor consultants want to show how humor can produce greater cohesion amongst the workforce and thereby increase efficiency and productivity. This is beautifully caught in the slogan. I'm not making this up. I found this. The slogan, laughter loves company and companies love laughter. Right? Now, management consultants refer to this as structured fun. Right? Structured fun, which includes innovations like Inside Out Day, where all employees are asked to wear their clothes inside out, Silly Hat Day, which rather speaks for itself, or Slap the Boss around the face with a wet fish day. I just made that one up, actually. Now, despite the sort of bonhomie that this might inspire, it's difficult not to be cynical about these sorts of endeavors. The question is about structured fun is who's structuring the fun and for what end? Who's structuring the fun and for what end? This sort of structured fun, I think, is a sort of compulsory happiness. It's one of the ways in which employers are regulating employees' private lives, as it were, through things like fun and humor. You become part of the company by laughing together, engaging in structured fun. But this is... Let me tell you a story. I was staying in Atlanta recently, in January, at a huge hotel. I had occasion to observe some structured fun from my breakfast table. In one of the vast, anonymous, carpeted, windowless suites that pepper every large hotel in the United States, 50 people from the same company were engaged in collective hopscotch, frisbee, and kickball. It was quite a sight. Much yelping and clapping was to be heard. The very soundtrack to happiness, I pondered. But looking at the sweating, slightly desperate faces of mostly overweight grown-ups, one felt almost moved to tears. After breakfast, I found a huddle of employees standing outside, resolutely smoking in the Georgian January drizzle. Smoking is sort of anti-right. Communities of smokers form as ways of, as it were, being outside the space of the company. I was enormously reassured, and because they felt just as cynical about the whole business as I did. One of them said to me they didn't want to appear to be a bad sport or a party pooper, and that's why they went along with it. Also, he concluded they weren't really offered a choice, and there was no either structured fun or nothing. And this reveals something, I think, interesting. There is a vitally subversive feature of humour in the workplace. Namely, as much as humour consultants might try and formalise fun for the benefit of the company, where the comic punchline and the economic bottom line might be seen to blend, such fun is always capable of being ridiculed by informal, unofficial relations amongst employees, by backchat, by salacious gossip. Anyone who's worked in an office, anyone who's worked in a factory, will know how the most scurrilous and usually obscene stories, songs, and cartoons about the management circulate. They're the very bread and butter of survival. Humour might well be a management tool, but it's also a tool against the management. And I very much hope that such things take place at Google. So there is a sort of interesting phenomenon here. There's a way in which workplaces will be structured along practices of humour, but there's still a way in which that can be subverted and ridiculed, informally, at the edges of the corporation, in terms of what you'll say privately, in terms of the mostly sort of obscene, gossip and salacious chit-chat and gags about people. And that's also a way in which humour functions. Laughter is contagious. Think about the phenomenon of giggling. Giggling is a very interesting phenomenon. It's a physiological phenomenon that you usually try to suppress. Think of giggling in the context of a too formal talk like this one, right? If you're giggling, say, in school or something, you can barely contain it, and it hurts. Giggling really hurts. One might say that the simple telling of a joke recalls us to what is shared in our everyday practices. It makes explicit what is implicit in our social life. To this extent, there's an interesting story to be told here about humour. Why I chose the theme of humour rather than the comic and jokes is that the word humour goes back to ancient medicine, the doctrine of the four humours in Galen and the rest. The idea of humour as something jocular, as something funny, begins in a time and place. It begins in the English language at the end of the 17th century. Before that, you would have said, like Ben Jonson's play, Every Man in His Humour, from the early 17th century, was just as it were, your humour was your disposition, the way you were feeling. Humour as something funny is a late 17th century innovation. And that's why there's this constant linking of the English with humour, because it's something that begins in the English language at a certain point in time. There's a lot more to say about that. The first theorist of humour was an aristocrat called Shaftesbury. And he wrote in 1709 a book called Sensus Communis, an essay on the freedom of wit and humour. So, sensus communis, common sense, or sociability. So for Shaftesbury, humour is a way in which we express our sociability, our being together. So humour reveals the depths of what we share. But crucially, it does this not through the clumsiness of a theoretical description, but more quietly, practically, and discreetly. Laughter suddenly breaks out in a line for the bus, or watching Hillary Clinton give a speech, or when someone farts in an elevator. Or indeed, if Hillary Clinton farted in an elevator. But that's another story. The humour here is an exemplary practice. It's an exemplary practice because it is something everyday, absolutely ordinary, that invites us to become spectators on our lives. And to that extent, it invites us to become philosophers. So my interest in humour is a philosophical interest. In telling jokes, in looking at the world from this Martian perspective, we take a philosophical view of the world. That's to say, people will say that philosophy is unworldly or abstract. And one of the reasons for being interested in humour is to say, well, look, here is a practice, an actually existing social practice, which people do all the time. and they're doing something philosophical with it. They're looking at the world that they inhabit and imagining it some other way. Right? This is why Wittgenstein, to quote him again, said that he could imagine a book of philosophy that would be entirely written in the form of jokes. He didn't do this. He wrote the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which begins with, the world is all that is the case, which isn't exactly a gag, and ends with, what cannot be said must be passed over in silence, which doesn't exactly get the ribs tickling. But maybe you get the point. The extraordinary thing about humor is that it returns us to common sense. It returns us to our basic sociability by distancing us from it. Humor familiarizes us with a common world through its miniature strategies of defamiliarization. It reveals what we share, but also, crucially, as I've tried to emphasize, it can change the situation that we inhabit. So humor isn't just about sensus communis, common sense, it's also about what we might call dissensus communis, an experience of dissent. At its most powerful, say, in the insanely punning dialogues between Chico and Groucho Marx, or in the best bits of Monty Python, humor is a paradoxical form of speech that defeats our expectations, producing laughter with its verbal inversions, contortions, and explosions. Let me end by telling you two jokes. These are two of my favorite jokes. Maybe I won't tell you the second. I'll see about the nun joke if I'm feeling bold. But the first joke is Groucho Marx, one of Groucho Marx's favorite jokes. A man goes to a psychoanalyst because he's lost the will to live. And he sees the psychoanalyst for a number of meetings. It goes on, and he's entirely miserable. Nothing can be done for him. And then at the end of a session, the psychoanalyst says to the guy, says, well, I know what you should do. Tonight, in town, the world's funniest comedian is playing, is performing in town, Grok. I urge you to go and see Grok, and when you see Grok, you'll feel better. And the man stands up, the patient stands up, says nothing, walks toward the door. And the analyst says, by the way, what is your name? He says, I am Grok. Right? Now, what that reveals is the fact that there's like a splitting in the self that happens with humor. Right? This takes us to another line of thought, which I'd be happy to go into if you like. In the best gags, I think, there's a gag that Freud liked to tell, which is a man is condemned to be hanged. And on the morning of his execution, he walks into the courtyard, and he's got the gallows ahead of him, leaves the cell, he's got the gallows ahead of him, awaiting death. He looks up at the sky and says, well, the week's beginning nicely. Right? Well, the week's beginning nicely. Now, Freud says, what's funny about that gag? What's funny about that gag, we didn't find it funny, is that the condemned man looks at himself from outside of himself and finds himself ridiculous. He laughs at himself. So there is this function in humor where I look at myself from outside myself and I find myself a source of risibility. The best humor is like that. I engage in a splitting within myself, like Grok. I am Grok, I'm the world's funniest comedian, and I've lost the will to live. And those two things together. The last joke is going to be about bears. Another feature of humor is the inversion of the relationship between the human and the animal. A lot of gags play with that. By either reducing humans to an animal level or raising animals to a human level. And here's one example. There's a bear. No, there's a hunter. There's a hunter in the woods, and he's in the woods and he's hunting. He's got a gun, and he comes to a clearing in the woods, and he waits there. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun's at a certain angle. He waits there. He's got his gun poised and cocked, and this bear comes running out of the woods. Ooh, huge grizzly bear runs towards him. He shoots and he misses. The bear grabs hold of him, flips him over, and viciously sodomizes him. It's awful. awful situation. So understandably, the man is a little bit upset, a little bit peeved, we might say. So that he goes back to the town and buys another gun. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, same place, in the clearing, with his gun, waiting. Sun's in the right position, he's waiting. And the bear comes running out into the clearing again. He takes his gun, shoots, and misses for a second time. Bear grabs hold of him, flips him over, same thing. And he's absolutely furious, you know, as you'd imagine, having been doubly sodomized by a bear. I don't know how many of you have been, but it's not pleasant. Let me tell you that. And and then he goes. He says, "I'm going to get this bear if it's the last thing I do." He goes back to the city, gets an AK-47 assault rifle. Right? Comes back to the same spot. It's AK-47, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Sun's at the right angle. He's sitting there waiting at the edge of the clearing. And 3 o'clock, the bear emerges, running towards him, huge grizzly bear. And he takes the AK-47 assault rifle, and unbelievably, he misses for a third time. The bear comes over to him, puts his arm around his shoulder and says, "Look, this isn't really about hunting, is it?" And so what you have in that, the incongruity in that gag is the animal becomes human. And one laughs. When you flip that around and the human becomes animal, say, for example, we give the strangest books to children, right? Gulliver's Travels is, usually just give the first 2 books of Gulliver's Travels. The 4th book of Gulliver's Travels is about the voyage to the land of the Houyhnhnms. And the Houyhnhnms are talking animals, horses, talking horses. Swift's point is that if you believe the human being is a rational animal, then why not a talking horse? And in that situation, the humans are called yahoos. Yahoos, that's where the idea of Yahoo comes from. I shouldn't give advertising to Yahoo, I guess. And the yahoos are sitting in trees, shitting on the ground and the rest. And in those situations, that doesn't really invite laughter as a sort of disgust with the species. So the crucial aspect of humor is this human-animal split. I could go on, but I won't go on. Thank you very much for listening.